Welcome, welcome. We are just waiting for one of our amazing panelists to join us before starting the seminar, but we are keen to start on the dot, so very, very soon. We are delighted that we have you all here today. Hang on, I'm just checking to make sure. Can everybody in the participants hear me who are attending? Yes, great, thank you. That's wonderful, thank you. Yes, we have an amazing panel of speakers who have been really generous with their time to take out time from their very busy diaries, as 16 Days of Activism provides extra work for us, but also opportunities. So we really appreciate their time. And we are here to discuss some of the findings of the COVID report that we have produced as the Faith and VAWG Coalition. I'm sure it will put links to the research will be to the report will be posted in the chat, but it's also on our website. I'm not sure if we can have a split screen, but you should have an agenda posted up soon on the screen, and maybe also links. Good morning, Dr. Eva Kenny Redzy. We are live on the webinar, so thank you so much for hosting. We can now begin a proper. But yes, as I was saying, we will be posting links to the research or to the COVID paper, as we have affectionately came to know it, in the link in the chat. We are also, here's the split screen for the agenda for today's running order of things. I will be doing a welcome, and then I will present some of the main kind of findings of the report that we've put together, and then hand over to Naima for the panel discussion, which will hopefully provide you with lots of food for thought, and then we will have time for question and answer. I hope that's okay, everybody. We have, before we start, I'd like to thank Fran and Zainab, who have been working so hard and diligently on putting things together behind the scenes. So in case we don't get time to thank you properly, I would really like to make sure that your contribution and hard work is recognised. So thank you so much for making today and this particular hour so interesting and accessible to everyone. Okay, so the COVID report that we have put together really is an opportunity to talk about the experiences, some of the experiences that survivors from faith communities have been subject to since the lockdown. I know that the women's sector has been really excellent and vocal about the experiences of survivors throughout the period of lockdown and the impact that that's had on the experiences. And all of the panelists here today have been dealing with that in some shape, way or form. And I know that the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole, has been at the forefront of advocating in government for the needs of survivors. So thank you to her and all of you on the panel for all your efforts and labour in trying to centre the needs of survivors that you've worked with during this really particularly tumultuous time. I guess what we felt is important to highlight is that actually, whilst we have made some gains as a sector in centering the needs of survivors, what we have found as the Faith and VAWG Coalition members, of whom you will see the membership posted on the screen, the logos, but also you will find them mentioned in the report, both as members and contributors, is that there seems to be a particular type of survivor whose needs are not actually either heard or therefore met. And these are particularly survivors from faith backgrounds. And we have tried to highlight some of the issues that they feel they would like practitioners like us in the webinar today to hear, but also policymakers such as Nicole and the Home Office, and anybody else who is involved in commissioning services and writing protocols to know about. So that's the point of this paper, is to highlight the needs of the voices of survivors, both to policymakers and practitioners, but also to their own communities. And hopefully you will hear that come through in the report. Some of the main top line findings that women have said are important for them to be heard is that actually, particularly for faith communities and faith leaders, and in the report you will see that we take the word faith leaders, or the concept of faith leaders, to mean, in its most inclusive sense, to mean anyone with constituency in faith communities, not necessarily just kind of faith leadership that is recognized formally by institutions, but also that have constituency within the community. So what do they want faith community leaders to know? Well, they want them to know that faith communities in themselves play a unique and vital role in the response to the elimination of domestic abuse and violence against women and girls. They want them to know that actually men's abuse is escalating during the pandemic, and in fact it's also manifesting in different ways, responding to the limitations of their abuse. And now that we've heard actually that increasingly women are being reported by perpetrators, by their survivors, to the police as actually them being the perpetrators rather than the other way around. Also that they want faith leaders to know that the factors such as the inability of women to get out of the home and seek support, the fact that job loss and furloughing have all added to the pressures of confinement, as well as homeschooling, to the escalation of men's abuse and violence towards women. What they want specialist services to know, for policymakers to know that actually faith and religion can be a source of support and comfort to survivors of faith, and that specialist services, policymakers, commissioners and funders urgently need to understand the varying manifestations of abuse and how the mix of culture and faith and religious tradition, as well as holy scripture, can be used as a tool for abuse, as well as a tool of empowerment. One of the most important obstacles facing survivors of faith has been finding a safe space, which, as we know, is something that all survivors find difficult, but an appropriate, culturally sensitive as well as faith sensitive safe space is very hard to find. Actually, that we also want the COVID policymakers and practitioners to know that the COVID pandemic has made visible the multiple intersections of inequality and discrimination faced by migrant women in particular, who tend to also come from faith communities, and faith communities in the way the services understand them tends to be racialized. And we also want them to know that the pandemic has led to an increased concern and spike in stalking, particularly cyber stalking, but also because women are more easily located in their homes or at work, they are more vulnerable to being at a high risk from stalkers than previously before. So what are our recommendations? We have three main ones really that are top line, but you'll find the nuanced detail in the report. They are: local and central government should evidence the value with which they hold buy and for services and organizations by adequately resourcing them. So if you recognize how important the specialist sector is, but also how important faith sensitive and culturally sensitive services, and please do resource us as we need help more than ever. Faith communities, including leaders, should be seen as allies in the fight against VAWG and domestic abuse. And we also need to create support spaces like the Faith and VAWG Coalition that understand and appreciate the complexity of the relationship between faith, domestic abuse and violence against women and girls. So that's our main findings and recommendations for policymakers and specialist services. I'd like to now hand over to Naima, who will be moderating and facilitating the discussion with our esteemed panel. But before I hand over to her, I think you should know a little bit about Naima if you don't already. So Naima has been director of the Inclusive Mosque Initiative since August 2020. What a time to be in charge, Naima, but thank God that you are. She has overseen the implementation of the Inclusive Mosque Initiative strategy to being radically inclusive intersectional feminist practice to Muslim social justice work. She has a background in philanthropy sector and in communication roles in the third sector. She is a regular contributor to radio shows and topics including feminism, religion and the arts. And Naima was program manager of the first M-Fest, the Muslim Fest UK in 2018, which I attended, which was absolutely phenomenal and an amazing initiative that I really hope can be replicated. A little bit about the Inclusive Mosque Initiative so that you have some awareness of them. Please do go and visit their website. The Inclusive Mosque Initiative is dedicated to creating safe and inclusive space for worship and spiritual practice, to the promotion of inclusive Islamic principles, and to centering and uplifting the voices and experiences of marginalized people within Muslim communities. To them, this means having a critical awareness of the dynamics of power and privilege and working against racism, including anti-Blackness, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, homophobia and gender-based discrimination, poverty, ableism and environmental damage, and all the ways they intersect in that space. They are in particular aware of expressing solidarity with immigrants, refugees, disabled, working class and poor Black and brown people, and they are critical of the state violence of these in which these communities experience, and the excessive surveillance, police brutality and prison industrial complex and national borders, as well as poverty and the prevent duty, to name but a few. So in connection with this, they have a very clear policy about funding and the work in which they engage with. So without further ado, Naima, please do take over and facilitate today's this morning's discussion. Thank you also for your time with us today.
No problem at all. Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. Thanks also to all our panelists for joining us today, and to all of you. I know a Monday morning is quite an ask, but this is a particularly phenomenal report to have launched at this time and very much needed. So my job now is to go into the bios and introduce you to our panel. And I'd like to start with Dr. Eva Kenny Redzy. Eva is a senior lecturer on the forensic, clinical and community psychology courses at the University of East London. Her research interests include, and this is quite a list, everybody, intersectional feminist perspectives on experiences of the body, violence and abuse, gender, race, culture, faith, mental distress and forensic psychiatric facilities using qualitative visual creative methods. Her current project looks at how faith communities within Black British Pentecostal churches respond to reports of domestic abuse. Eva was invited to join this project after carrying out research with African and Caribbean heritage women with experience of violence, abusive women, and they all shared that their faith, religion or spirituality was important in their journey towards safety and recovery. Eva is also a trustee of the End Violence Against Women Coalition. I'll move on to Faeeza Vaid, MBE. Faeeza has an academic background in law and religious studies and extensive understanding of the lived experiences of Muslim women in the UK. Faeeza has combined her knowledge, skills, confidence and passion for justice in order to be a force for social change through research, advocacy, campaigning and policy development in the UK. Faeeza's master's dissertation done at the University of Warwick was called Notions of Scholarly Religious Knowledge, Authorities in Muslim Societies and Muslim Women's Movements as Challenges to the Current Status Quo. She became Executive Director of Muslim Women Network UK in September 2011 and has proved herself as a standout leader with excellent operational and strategic management skills. Her role has involved a myriad of projects in programme development, training and facilitation, and as a naturally talented public speaker, she promotes issues through speaking events and in the media. In the 2019 Queen's New Year's Honours, Faeeza was awarded an MBE for services to women's rights. I'll move on now to Nicole Jacobs. Nicole is the Designate Domestic Abuse Commissioner. Since her appointment in the role in September 2019, Nicole has begun energetically putting her 20 years of experience in domestic abuse policy and intervention work, driving improvements to transform the response to domestic abuse in England and Wales. She's committed to championing victims and survivors of all ages, status and backgrounds, and to shining a light on practices that fail them. We've just heard from the lovely Huda Jawad, and if you don't know Huda's bio, you're about to hear it now. So Huda was born in Baghdad and left Iraq at the age of 2. She travelled the Middle East throughout her childhood and eventually arrived as a political refugee, settling in the UK in 1988. Huda has held various positions in local government, national and international NGOs and charities, tackling a range of issues including social exclusion, justice, equality. In 2011, she was the coordinator for a research project that tracked the lives of 100 women who had left their abusive partners for 3 years. She's a member of Musawa, the Global Movement for Equality and Justice in the Muslim Family, and is also a 2017 CLAW Social Fellow and co-chair of End Violence Against Women Coalition, which is working to end violence against women and girls in all its forms in the UK. She's a co-founder of the Faith and VAWG Coalition. Thank you so much for listening. I just want to add a quick note about my chairing before I go into the first question. So we have until 12:15 for this panel discussion, and then we have 15 minutes of Q&A time. I'm really eager for everyone to get a chance to speak and to not eat into the Q&A time. So if I'm a little bit boisterous and just interrupt and overspeak, I apologize in advance, but those are my reasons. So if it's okay, I'm going to go to Dr. Kanyeredzi first. Eva, you've worked with faith leaders who want to address domestic abuse and support survivors. Can you tell us a bit about the challenges and the opportunities that leaders in particular have experienced in their work through this pandemic so far? You're on mute, Eva, sorry.
Onto the mute button. Okay. Yes, so I am the research lead for a project called the Black Church Domestic Abuse Forum that's looking at how can church leaders better respond to reports of domestic abuse coming from their congregations. Now, the organizations that we're working with, or the churches, or the communities that we're working with, have traditionally supported people recently migrating into the UK from countries in Africa and the Caribbean, and have supported them in settling. So the people who they're working with are marginalized somewhat, or can be at certain points in their migration histories. And also these churches have come about as a result of being excluded from kind of mainstream churches historically. So they're very good. They have a very strong kind of social justice element to them, but not so much on domestic abuse. So our project really is trying to initially train church leaders in understanding domestic abuse, understanding coercive control, and then empower them to better able to respond to congregants when they approach them. So what we found so far is that churches have been responding somewhat to people when they've been approached for domestic abuse, and there is a massive gap in their understandings of how best to respond to churchgoers, and trying to map who they can get within the communities to support them in supporting women. In terms of COVID in particular, we were piloting our training and evaluation. We're in the midst of piloting our training and evaluation with churches in London and the Midlands. And then COVID happened, and we were requested to provide additional kind of workshops and training from churches, and what can they do during COVID? Is there anything that they can do as a church? So some of the leaders had ideas of, maybe offering up their spaces because they weren't using their physical spaces anymore. And what could they do on their websites to inform people looking to be supported about what their options are in relation to domestic abuse. So we hosted a workshop, a really successful workshop with a number of church leaders. And currently what we're doing is, after we've trained church leaders in domestic abuse, and the training is on domestic abuse, but also related to the context of kind of Black British Pentecostal background. So the context is actually steeped in the religious script, in the religious scriptures. So in order for and the people who deliver the training are also pastors. So they're part of the coalition. They're also pastors and counsellors who are working progressively against domestic abuse. So we train pastors within the context of Christianity that they're familiar with, using Bible stories, and try to get them to a place where they can begin to work with their safeguarding lead and to set up a response to domestic abuse. And the idea being that they will become more connected to the resources within the local community. So for example, one of the churches that we've been working with, since working with us, they've joined the multi-faith group, which is within their local area. So it's multi-faith, and they're also responding to domestic abuse. So the hope is that the churches become visibly zero tolerance spaces for domestic abuse, whereby people who are experiencing, women who are experiencing domestic abuse, know that this is a place that they can go for help. And we are working on brokering that relationship between specialized services and the faith communities who we're working with.
Thank you. That sounds like a lot of incredibly practical, dynamic stuff going on. Before I move to Faeeza, can I ask you, Eva, about a point that Huda made in her presentation just now, when she said that faith leaders want the whole sector to know that they are allies in the fight against domestic violence. What can you tell us about current status quo and what needs to shift?
I mean, well, absolutely, yes. I think we initially began this project in 2016, and we've worked really quite sensitively around, how we engage faith leaders, what we say. We have a toolkit that we use as the basis for training, kind of developed with permission from Restored, to contextualize to the kind of Black Christian, Black Pentecostal context. And in relation to that, I think what we're expecting was a lot of resistance to this work. But what we found is there is kind of a growing, really progressive bunch of faith leaders within that particular context who want to know how to support their congregants better, who want to know what they can do more within their particular spaces. I think there are tensions within specialized services that kind of have this broad brush approach in regards to faith communities. They see them largely as complicit with domestic abuse, or complicit with kind of, violence against women and whatnot, what have you. But this doesn't take into consideration women's lives and what women want. So you will find women within faith communities who may be social workers or counselors, but they may not necessarily seek help outside of, or certainly not initially, outside of their faith communities for experiences such as domestic abuse. And the argument that we're making within the Black Church Domestic Abuse Forum, as well as what I've made previously when I interviewed women, was that we need to think about how do we respond to women where they feel safe, where they feel it's best to have that kind of support. And rather than saying to women, no, you can't get the support here, you need to go to this place. And there are all these concerns. I mean, Huda mentioned in terms of the report surrounding whether those aspects of a woman's identity, that being her faith, will be well supported if she seeks help, outside of that particular context. Does the woman have to leave her faith in order to get support for domestic abuse? And one of the things that we're arguing is that if women feel safe within the spaces where they're continually frequenting, why not make those spaces more responsive to domestic abuse? Why not empower those particular spaces to work better with specialized services in order to better respond to women? Because some women may never go to a refuge. And what we've found also is that churches have been historically supporting women, perhaps funding them funding them to be rehoused, but without actually stating that they're a domestic abuse responsive service.
I'm sure we're going to come back to a lot of those points, and I think it's really great contextualization. For additional context, I want to move to Faeeza though, because Faeeza, and correct me if I've got the statistics wrong here. So Muslim Women Network runs a helpline, and did I get this correctly, that 39% of the calls received are to do with domestic abuse? And with that in mind, sorry, say again?
Go ahead, sorry.
With that in mind, what do we in the sector need to understand about the systems and the surrounding context that people experience? What do you hear through the calls that we can bear in mind as we move forward?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here on this really, I guess, ever important discussion. So the Muslim Women's Network Helpline started in 2015. And part of the reason it started was exactly for the reason that Eva just mentioned, that women needed a space where they felt they could speak about their faith and culture, and it was okay to be included in the issues that they were presenting, that it was okay to say, I'm having, mental health issues and I need to speak about it, but this is why, this is a particular experience that I'm having as a Muslim woman, and I feel like my faith is, is important to my exploration of this issue. So since 2015, we have helped over 5,000 individuals. And in 2020, so this year, looking at my statistics thus far, 39% of calls have been on domestic abuse. And the other top issues are mental health issues, loneliness, isolation, marriage and divorce is always in our top 5 issues, obviously relationships, and that's no different in the COVID situation. I think what COVID has really done is shone a really bright spotlight on the inequalities that exist more broadly in society, but also the issues that people are facing in their lives individually. And in terms of the Muslim Women's Network Helpline and how we responded to COVID-19, particularly on the issue of domestic abuse, in the first couple of weeks after lockdown, so 23rd of March and then going into April, lots of bigger national charities were reporting that domestic abuse saw a massive spike. Actually, the Muslim Women's Network Helpline did not see that spike at that level. And so what we started to do was question why. And for us, because as Huda mentioned, we're hot on our data and we're really in touch with the cases which are coming through, we understood that particular communities, so in our case, Muslim women, may find it more difficult to report. And why were they finding it more difficult to report? Well, many of them live in extended families. There's additional barriers like language barriers. The safe spaces that they would find to report were now shut. So going to schools, going to children's centers, just being outside was not available to them. So then they were in their homes. And then you have to ask the question about the digital divide. Did they have access to devices? If they had access to devices, well, and they had kids at home, did they actually have real access, or were the kids were we all trying to homeschool at that point? So what the Muslim Women's Network did in response was we created 5 videos, safety message videos in different languages: Arabic, Urdu, Gujarati, Sylheti, Bengali, and English. And they were about a minute long. And we circulated these videos via WhatsApp because we figured that although a Muslim woman, may not be online, she may be on WhatsApp, and she may be able to communicate. There's lots of parent groups. I know we all are on too many WhatsApp groups in our lives, but this seemed to be a medium that was really accessible to our audience. And I think this really goes to the point that we often talk about Muslim women and other groups as marginalized communities, as hard to reach communities, when in fact, I think sometimes it's easier for us to ignore them. And we need to think about ways of being more innovative when reaching out to these communities at any given moment. And in that particular moment, particularly in the early weeks of lockdown, WhatsApp was certainly a good opportunity for connection to these women who were finding it more difficult to make reports of domestic abuse. And in the weeks following on from the circulation of these videos, we did see an increase in our calls on domestic abuse. And what I would say, you know, I know there's professionals on the call today, is that, you know, this was just me doing this in my front room on an iPhone. It doesn't need to be high tech and take months to develop. These things, you know, these opportunities are there, and I think we just need to take them and be smarter about what we're putting out there in terms of our messaging and how we're doing that. I just want to say though that also thinking through kind of how we operate is really important. So obviously the Muslim Women's Network Helpline is predominantly a phone line, so people call in. With lockdown and COVID, we have extended our email service, our web chat service, like many others I know. And for those people with access to computers and to the internet, I think that has been really useful. So we've got more email contacts coming through now. It's also on our, so if you phone the helpline, there's a kind of pre-message which says, you know, you can email through. And I think that's been really helpful to people who found it more difficult to have a telephone conversation. So I think I'll stop there, and then, you know, I'm sure we can pick some of this up.
Yeah, Faeeza, thank you. That is really, really useful, especially in thinking about that period at the start of the pandemic, when we had lots of restricted movement and people were very eager to seek out information. And so looking at how people were seeking out information would have been really useful. Nicole, could I come to you? You've worked to address domestic abuse for over 20 years. How has your understanding and your experience of inclusivity over that time, how has that changed or evolved?
Well, thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm learning quite a lot just listening to the other panelists, and it's always good to be alongside Huda in anything that she's doing. Partly, I think the fact that I'm hearing things that I haven't heard before in terms of what's been happening is probably proof of one of the findings of this report, which is needing to have a lot more spaces like this where we're understanding what's happening. So that's a good lesson for me to think about. I guess when I reflect on 20 years or so, I think one of the things is, you know, what's interesting to me within the sector in general now is this focus on, you know, lived experience. But I guess my view is most of the domestic abuse services were founded and run by people with lived experience. Like that's how they ever got there a lot of times. And I think they would have been, you know, probably by who was founding and who was involved on various levels of inclusion. In other words, sometimes those could have been really inclusive environments, very rooted in community, and maybe sometimes not as much. And so I think the context is just to know, I think, you know, a healthy view of most domestic abuse services or sexual violence services or services for violence against women and girls in general have usually had some kind of founding in people with lived experience getting together and wanting to do something collectively about it. And I guess it's just who was involved at that time would really impact. But I also think services have also developed in the context of scarcity. So having to make inroads and not feeling very heard by kind of dominant culture anyway. And so that scarcity then has created over time, I think, real silos in the way that people then start to work and become more and more inclusive or increasingly inclusive. I think there's a wider context as to how charities in this sector have felt never heard as loud as they needed to be, never funded or supported or resourced and then it becomes, it can create a less inclusive environment because of that. And so I do think that's worth saying. I don't think it's necessarily kind of built that way. I think the scarcity of the environment has created some of that a little bit in terms of commissioning frameworks and competition. And these are the kinds of things we're talking about more and more now. I think in terms of the faith community in particular, what was said earlier is absolutely right. I think the feeling within domestic abuse services or services in general is that faith communities wouldn't be an ally necessarily, because they might have seen instances where that wasn't true, or have felt in their own life and their own experiences that not being the case. But I think, again, because of, you know, all of this work is ever evolving, and all of our understanding, hopefully we remain really open-minded and trying to evolve our, you know, what things we're doing well, and give ourselves, you know, be gentle with ourselves about things that we've done well, but also be challenging with ourselves about things that need to be improved. And I think this kind of coalition, and that's why I've been so excited about it, helps to broaden our discussions and recognize the role that faith and faith communities have probably have always been playing, but in a silo. And what I've always loved about what Huda does at Standing Together, and I think others panelists do, is this idea of bridging these silos, you know, really creating meaningful relationships. And one of the things that Huda's always talked about that I've been really inspired by is this idea of saying, well, this isn't transactional, kind of about training, you know, faith communities coming and training the sector or vice versa. It's about creating kind of a much more meaningful relationship and an understanding and trust. And I think that is just such a huge win if we could start to go about things, commission services or commission spaces, making sure we support these kinds of spaces so that there's a much greater general understanding. And I think COVID has been an opportunity that's opened up more conversations, ironically, because of this virtual space where people can get together. And I think it's because there's been such concern about domestic abuse and wider issues of violence against women and girls during this time. There's been a lot more active discussions. And I think we really want to build on those. You know, I think obviously we wouldn't have wanted COVID to happen, and nobody would. But if we could think about some of the things we've learned, how much we're speaking to each other is a real improvement. And I think it has helped widen the gap that was there, and really helping to understand, you know, how we can go forward and really build on what we've got here. So I suppose, I hope that sounds right. I think in terms of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office, I just would want to say how committed I am to really helping create some of that space that is in the report. And certainly all three aspects of the findings of the report, the value of buy-in for services, really thinking about faith communities as allies. I know in the domestic abuse bill, some of the bishops, for example, in the House of Lords, and some of the religious leaders in the House of Lords are really getting behind the migrant issues related to migrant women. And I hope those are just the kinds of examples we're starting to see right now, either in relation to COVID or the domestic abuse bill. But certainly from my office,
context on the Commissioner's Office. Sorry to interrupt. We've got about 6 minutes left of panel time, and I just want to encourage anyone from the attendees not on the panel to post questions in the chat if there's anything that you want us to go to, because at 12:15 we'll jump to your questions. But before then, and Nicole, thanks. The point that you made, especially about sort of looking at who has set up organisations, what experiences they're coming from, and how that might shape inclusivity and how we think of it, I think is really useful for us to go back and be a bit introspective and reflective of all of us, our spaces, and the DNA we might have created at those embryonic stages. I think is really interesting. Huda, you have a lot of experience in both the wider secular VAWG sector and working with faith communities, and you're a woman of faith. So could you tell us a bit about your experiences as a person who's visibly Muslim, working in secular spaces, and what your experiences have been and what you think might need to shift?
Yeah, thank you. I think, part of the reason that we founded the Faith and VAWG Coalition has been to create that space that sits at these intersections, that is quite niche in the sector. Obviously, the sector has historical context of time of when it was created, in the 70s, post World War II, and the kind of the increasingly secular revolution in terms of a more opening of society to a more egalitarian and progressive ways of thinking and being, and the exploration of what that might look like for people, which is amazing. And the fact that we have a secular space that attempts to see everyone as equal is important. But I think certainly lived experience has proved otherwise. Often, if you are from a visibly religious background, there are certain assumptions made about your beliefs, your ways of thinking, your practice, your values, and your judgments, which tends to kind of really be born from a historical kind of post 30 years war Westphalia type model for those interested in history and international relations, in which the church in Europe played a very significant role in conflict and conflict resolution, I guess. I think being a racially visible different religious person is another dynamic. So, and in many ways, at the Faith and VAWG Coalition, I've often we have looked around conversations around what it is to be a white Christian woman, and what it is to be a visible religious person from minoritized communities, and how that's a very different experience. I remember talking to Christian friends who are white, and she was particularly from Manchester, and she said, I wish people knew I was a Christian, because then they would see my faith rather than being invisible. So I think that's interesting. But we often talked about the Faith and VAWG Coalition being a supportive space, because we often feel like we are at this a struggle or a kind of a journey that tries to live two separate worlds. But for us, the embodiment is different. We don't necessarily feel that they are polar opposites, but we recognize that there is a place where the two or the three or the four may rub against each other and require reconciliation. And so we are in that space of ruptures, which we navigate all the time. And I could ask all the panelists here who have of a particular faith background to explain that and relate to it. So we do know when to be outwardly. Sometimes in the feminist space, I feel like I have to declare my feminism a lot more obviously and loudly than other sisters may have. Sometimes in religious spaces, I have to even declare my faith in more obvious ways, and defend being a feminist as something that is inherently part of my faith identity. So yeah, sometimes our faith is used as a racial category, which is not really relevant to how we practice. Sometimes faith is lumped in as this homogenous way of being, but actually within our faith communities, we're very, very diverse. And somehow faithful feminists, as I like to call them, have to have a already synthesized version of what the ruptures into faith and feminism look like way before secular feminists have to. So in some ways we're often asked about, well, how do you reconcile this, and what about that, and what about this? And I'm thinking, well, sisters,
it gets really complex and quite need to be explicit in a lot of stuff. Faeeza, does this speak to your experiences as well?
I think I just wanted to mention that often what happens is that we assume that firstly, either, different groups of, depending on how we're defined, we are choosing to define somebody. We often expect that they are one monolithic group. So I often, as Muslim women, the assumption is that I come with like an auto download of the Quran and I speak for all women for all eternity in every country in the world right now. And I think we really need to throw this idea out the window and fully recognize that each of us is diverse. We have intersecting identities and carry so many different levels of privilege. And I know that word gets thrown around a lot right now, but we really need to think about how does that play out in the spaces that we, embody and are in, and looking at it from a kind of diversity and inclusion perspective. I really want us to be better at understanding that it's not just okay to have a tick box kind of, okay, one from that group, one from that group, one from that group, done. We have to recognize that not only do we need to look at who is not at the table. That's so important. Yes, we've got all, we have to get diversity at the table. That's important, of course, I'm saying that. But we also have to look at who are we not including in the table. And I would go a step further to say, before you've even set the table, get your diversity in check. So a diverse group of people should always be setting the table. We should not be inviting them to the table once it's been set. And we all need to be better at doing that.
Eva, could I also ask you to come in on this? I think there is an assumption that Christian communities are all the same or are easily categorizable. Can you say a bit more about the diversity of perspective and experience within Christian communities? Sorry, you're on mute again, Eva.
Sorry, yes. I can speak briefly about that. I would say that they're super diverse. Even in thinking about Black majority churches or churches where the majority of the populations are from either countries in Africa or from the Caribbean or South America, that's just a whole load of people from different countries in the Caribbean, different countries in Africa, and lots of different people could be attending who could be English, or it's multi-denominations, and not necessarily Pentecostal, but could also be Anglican or Roman Catholic, but the population of the church has changed over recent years. I think also what's specific in terms of kind of Black majority churches is also that history of discrimination based on racialization and race. And that is the original kind of organizing factor among those particular groups. So there are, as you can imagine, all of these tensions to do with discrimination as it stands, and anything else that sits on top of that always gets people concerned about the image of the faith community, the image of the family within those particular communities, when there is something else that can make them seem as if something is not working or they're contributing to some kind of pathological or dysfunctional presentation, both for the church communities and for the individuals. So there are really interesting dilemmas that women, victim survivors, need to negotiate in terms of understanding what's happening to them and what do they do in the aftermath. So I think when we're thinking of services and when we're thinking of women's lives, all of that needs to be part of the picture, and what may be the challenge for this particular individual in seeking support. And when we talk about safety and where people feel comfortable, it's not just about kind of the individual sense of I don't feel comfortable going to this particular place. It's people actually feel a sense of threat and unsafety, and that speaking or going outside of their particular circles will make it worse than what it is already. And I also think,
sorry, Eva, please carry on.
I wanted to say something else. I also wanted to say more on the topic of funding in particular. What has been our experience is, we'll approach funders and they go, this is an amazing idea, it's amazing. But no, we don't fund religious organizations. even though we're saying, well, we're working with women within these particular communities, not based around their religion, that's where they're sitting, but this is around domestic abuse. So I think there has to be something in terms of the communication and the understanding about these issues that don't close off women's experiences simply because they're women of faith.
Yeah,
so
I can
there has to be some
like
more
real...
around the issue. Yeah, I'll shut up now.
I really hear that. Like a real need to kind of, apologies for stepping over you, but a real need to kind of reassess our criteria for funding and what we understand to be proselytizing and where these spaces are useful, and a more complex view of that might help. And actually then questioning where and how the Charity Commission are helpful or unhelpful in this. Faeeza, you had your hand up, so I'll come to you.
No, I was literally just going to support Eva on that, because obviously we face the same, and I think it is the difference between propagation of faith. I mean, nothing that we do is propagation of faith, but it's also accepting that, you know, this is an important identity, and, you know, that women of faith may often need a space. I mean, on the MWN helpline, sometimes women come to us first, and then what we are doing is referring to a mainstream service. But it's almost like they need that confidence and that go ahead from us, just to, you know, establish, you know, their thoughts, get it together, and then they feel more confident going to a mainstream service and accessing that support. And it's not just domestic abuse, it's also, you know, with mental health services, for example.
Can I throw in a question from the audience then? So this is from Isabella, and it's about faith leaders, and that's okay, so I'll read it as Isabella's written it. While providing training to faith leaders, does any of the organisations have some kind of mechanism or system which may recognise perpetrators as well in this circle? Is there a risk of giving them extra tools or knowledge?
I mean, I'll just, because I'm unmuted, and then Eva, maybe you can come in. What I would say is, coming back to my point on the fact that we can't assume everyone's the same. You know, the fact is patriarchy exists rampantly in society more broadly, and still in faith communities also, and that will play out in different ways. But I agree with Eva that the shift to more willingness to tackle domestic abuse has certainly happened. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, our communities looked very different to what they look like today. And there is a growing movement of more, you know, gender justice and more gender equality. However, that doesn't mean that all faith, you know, so I fully agree with Isabella that we always need to be checking, but that's not just in faith communities. We need to be checking this all the time in any situation that we're working in. So Eva, I don't know if you have a formal check that you do in terms of your training.
Yes, that's a really good question. Thank you, Isabella. Just to also say that in the training, it's for victim survivors, but also for perpetrators, also for recognizing when people are seeking support on what to do. Because within what would be different within sort of the context that, say, we're particularly working with. If you're working with the church, then it's the person who's perpetrating could be in that same church community. Yeah. So it's understanding those safety issues for both within that particular context, and also the person who is delivering that initial support might be fully aware of the person who's been victimized and the person who's perpetrating the abuse. So what that says to us is that it's even more important that these particular communities are mobilized and empowered to respond in a way that's safe for the victim survivor, and can also enable the person who's perpetrating to access some support, or to be reported if that's what's agreed. Yes.
And I just want to add that, you know, I mean, all of us work within safeguarding policies and procedures for both adults and children. And that has to be at the fore, because that's what we're talking about. It's safeguarding, right? So that, you know, especially, you know, in the work that we do, that has to be, you know, there and underpins the work that we do. And just because you're a person of faith doesn't mean there's like a kind of, you know, free pass that we allow. We're very stringent on these things. The helpline is very stringent on these things. And so I guess what I just wanted to add was that when we look at faith communities, I mean, when we look at any communities, there will be a diversity of opinion on this, and domestic abuse is one of those things which unfortunately, happens so much right now across society that there's still a long way we need to go to ensuring that everyone's in agreement that it's not okay. That's why we have things like the 16 Days of Activism, because so much more work needs to happen in society on this issue.
So we only have 5 minutes left, and I wanted to come to all of you on a question from Davina about data. And Davina's given quite a lot of context here, so I'm just going to ask a more general question. Davina, I'm really sorry, I hope that's okay. But what can you tell us in your experience is really useful? What are useful questions or processes to think about when collecting data, and then also when putting that data to use in a way that serves survivors or victims of faith? Faeeza, can I come to you first, as Muslim Women's Network is brilliant with data?
I mean, look, I think I'm of the opinion that data is very important, because for a long time, what the lack of data does is give an excuse of writing off experiences as anecdotal. So when we used to go to roundtable discussions and say, a lot of people that we've come into contact with have said this, the response was often, well, how do you know that's true for lots of people? Now I'm able to tell you quite categorically, this is what the experience is. And of course, it's still a finite group of women. It's those women who managed to reach out to our service, know about the service, have had access to the service, all of those things, right? So there's already a caveat there in terms of our data. So for me, sharing data is important, but I fully recognize the risk that you're talking about, particularly when it's connected to, violence against women and girls, and how that may play out. And so what are the consequences of that data, and how will it be used? So the example I have is a few years ago, we raised concerns about a checklist at a police station, which was being used, and a couple of questions that were asked on this checklist were, what is the faith of the perpetrator, and were they practicing or not? So anyone of a faith will know that those are loaded questions already, because my interpretation of what practicing is will be completely different to what someone else is saying. So the questions in themselves were not problematic, but what is the consequence of answering practicing, and how will that play out on either the treatment of the victim or the treatment of the perpetrator? And of course, if you're making a correlation that if the person is practicing and they're highly violent, then that means something else, then that does become problematic. But, my opinion on this is the sharing of data is vitally important. And I think the fact is there's too much missing data, which is why we're also in a problematic situation. So I'm sorry, that's a bit of a not clear answer, but I hope it's helpful.
These things are always really difficult and tricky and complex. But that's still a really useful basis to be thinking about. And I just want to highlight something that Davina said, which I think is key to data and data practices. So they write that religion tends not to be mentioned unless the religion is not Christian. I think that's very interesting. Nicole, while we have you here, you mentioned being committed to supporting change, supporting the evolution of practices across the sector, and including at government level. Can you tell us a bit about what commitments you can make today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just writing down a few things to do just today after I get off the call, which is to make sure to send this report to key people, officials in government who might be in a position in relation to funding, and also just who need to be aware of this report being out there and the findings in it. So I see my role partly as someone said earlier, thinking who's at the table and who's not, and trying to open up some space and suggest as much as I can who should be leading these conversations. But I think there is a role in thinking about, I've had a couple of workshops with funders in this space, so not government funders, but foundations, to say, can we be more strategic? Have we ever thought together about being more strategic about how things are funded? And so again, just coming up to, just came up earlier, like what's the barrier in terms of some of these really amazing initiatives getting the funding that they need? So I think some of my role is a little bit of convening power trying to get people alongside and in conversations. And I certainly am committed to doing that. And then I think it's also about thinking policy-wise within government about the statutory guidance alongside the bill. There's a lot of things that are quite tangible. The VAWG strategy coming up in consultation with that. Obviously, everyone on this call is very well equipped to being in those conversations in their own right, but just kind of making sure as much as I can. And also we're hiring in our office regional leads for practice and partnerships. And so the very first thing I wrote down was the fact that I'd like my fellow panelists to meet with our head of practice and partnerships so we can really incorporate some of the wider faith-based communities and leaders to be part of these discussions more locally. So I have lots of things, I have lots of things on my to-do list about this, which I would, and obviously very open to suggestion. So really would want you to reach out and talk to me or anyone in my office about thoughts that you have.
Thank you so much. It's 12:31. I think that's a great way to close the call today, the webinar. Can I thank Zainab and Fran again for doing such a superb job putting this all together, and ask them to stick the download link in the chat again. It would be great for everyone to have a read of this. Contact your local communities, contact people you think this would be useful to. Please do share it. And Huda, is there anything else I should mention before we close the call?
No, just thank you everyone for being here today and making the time. You've done a brilliantly chaired event. Thank you so much, Naima. And to my fellow panelists, I hold you dearly. I recognize your work. I think you are brilliant at what you're doing. Keep blazing the trail. And to the fellow founders of the Faith and VAWG Coalition, we have a lot of work to do. So yeah, we'll get into it. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for listening and for spending this hour with us, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Okay.
Thank you.